Hi folks, I hope all of you are doing well. This time I'm going to be talking to you about introductions and thesis statements, or as I like to call them, the foundation of an academic essay. Now let me just give you a little bit of background information uh, about how my thoughts on these issues have changed over the years. When I first started teaching about 10 years ago and I would get to these topics, I would not only give, my students the kind of guiding points that I'm going to give you shortly, but I would give them copious examples of different introductions and different thesis statements, and it would become kind of like a game show. Which one is the better introduction? Which one is the better thesis? And I thought that with the combination of guide points and my teaching, that would miraculously solve any problems that my students had with these issues, and they'd all become great at writing introduction and thesis statements. Um, but to be honest with you, while there was some value to that approach of sort of comboing guide points with copious examples, I think I'm a little wiser when it comes to that. I am still gonna give you some guide points on this topic, some do's and don'ts, if you will, but I'm not gonna give you any examples of thesis statements or introductions because um, I've come to believe after my years of teaching on this topic and other ones like it that when it comes to the composition of a good introduction and when it comes to the composition of a good thesis statement, the only surefire way to get better at these two very important components of an essay is to work at it, to keep writing, to do it over and over again until you get a product and a writing sample that you're proud of and you think, meets the not only the criteria for that particular writing assignment, but your own expectations for yourself as a writer. So, I'm gonna give you guide points, gonna give you some things to think about, but we're gonna skip the examples, because again, I think ultimately, you know, all you can do is take these guide points, apply them to your own writing, and go from there. And then certainly if the information um, that I give you doesn't seem to be helping you, that's understandable. But if that happens, what I want you folks to do is reach out to me, let me know, send me a message, give me a call, and say, hey, Mr. M, I tried those techniques, they don't seem to be helping. Can you give me some other pointers? If that's the case, let me know. I'll be glad to do all that I can. But again, moving on, I don't want to ramble. I just want to make those disclaimers, if you will. So, what should an introduction do? First and foremost, it should introduce the topic of your writing assignment, particularly if you're engaged in a very complicated topic. You should, if needed, give background info about that topic. If there are problems connected with that topic, describe the problems. And what I mean by problems is not really in the sense of, is there something wrong in the role? It can be that you're trying to address through this essay, sort of a call to action paper or a warning paper. If we don't do this, bad thing X will happen. What I mean in a broader sense by that word problem is if there's a debate surrounding your topic, you want to describe, at least two sides of that debate. Often there'll be more perspectives than just two, particularly when you get into very complex social issues. Let's say, there are going to be a myriad of different opinions, different viewpoints, but for one of those kinds of topics, you want to describe that debate. You also want to grab your audience's attention. This is the introduction, the first point of contact that you have with your audience. So you want to, sort of wake them up, jolt them into paying attention to your paper. But as I'm gonna discuss in a little bit, you want to do that. That concept of grabbing the audience's attention. You want to make sure that you do that in an appropriate manner. And finally, the introduction should always guide the reader toward the thesis statement. And what I mean by guide the reader toward the thesis statement, you don't have to sort of generically repeat the thesis over and over again until you get to that precise statement that you intend as the thesis. But what we mean by that when we say guide the audience to the thesis is that you want to make sure that there's a pretty clear and a pretty well organized chain of reasoning about contained in your introduction that then leads up to the thesis statement. So for instance, if you were writing a paper about racism in America, prior to whatever your thesis statement is on that topic within the context of your essay, right? You're not going to want to start off by talking about, oh, my favorite food is hot dogs. Or when I was a child, I used to love going to baseball games with my dad. And then just sort of throw out at the interval that, oh, by the way, I'm going to be writing about, racism, and racism is bad. Now, we can, as we're going to talk about in a moment, you can start out broad with your introduction and then narrow down to the thesis. That's a perfectly legitimate way of, starting your paper. That's great. But you want to make sure that when you start out broad, that broad point that you start with is ultimately going to culminate in that thesis statement. Now, thesis statement, we'll talk about this more in just a little bit, or I will, and hopefully you'll listen. But the thesis statement, again, is that clear statement where you assert what you're going to try to argue or prove in a paper, okay? There are different ways to go about that, different things to think about, but I just want to make sure that I didn't want to take for granted, that you would, automatically understand what I mean by thesis statement without having said a little something about it. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so when I talked a moment ago about the idea that it's okay to start out broad in your introduction and then narrow down to your thesis statement, this is kind of, in many ways, what I was referring to. What's called the top-down model of developing an introduction to some other writing materials, especially the ones published by Terra State Community College. that they offer as a part of their writing program refer to this as the funnel concept or the funnel approach. Exact same technique, just different terminology. So I don't want you to be confused by that. Now, just as an example of how this process could work, let's say that you were let me use myself as an example. When I was an undergrad student like you folks are now, before I even started taking religion and faith seriously on a personal level for myself, I was always, especially at that age, very fascinated by religion and how it affects people, the way we interact with another. So, especially in my English literature courses where I could find a way of connecting it to a novel or whatever that we were reading, I frequently would write about religion in my essays. So just as an example of how this top-down method could work, I once wrote a paper about the clash of of different religious systems between a Native American culture and the European settlers who had arrived later. And, before I got to my thesis statement on the end result of that clash as it was portrayed through a Native American novel, I started out, by just making some observations about the religions in and of themselves. So Christianity on one side, and then this one particular Native American faith on the other. Just start out by describing them, and don't think that as you're describing them that you automatically have to assert, which one you're gonna favor or which one you think is better. It's okay to start out by just describing. That assertion part, which is necessary, where you lay it on the line, so to speak, and say to your audience, this is what I'm gonna try to prove. That's what your thesis statement is there for. But prior to that, it is quite fine to simply describe in sort of a non-judgmental manner before, you get to that asserting point in the thesis statement. So, again, moving on. Other ways that you could start your introductions. You could start by providing a quote that is related to the topic at hand. Again, if you're gonna provide a quote, make sure that it's a quote that is gonna be pretty clearly connected to what you're writing about, and the reader isn't kind of left wondering, what the heck is this person just sort of plopping the quote in there for. So quotes can be a great way of again grabbing the reader's attention, especially if it's from a noteworthy or famous person. I mean, there's no guessing, no wondering on one level why a lot of good essays on civil rights and racism in America will start with a quote by a key figure in those debates like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, what have you, because those are noteworthy people who were part of that conversation at a very pivotal moment in American sort of social history. So therefore, a quote from them is not only eye-catching, but pertinent. Okay, you can also begin your paper by stating a question. Okay, and then just moving forward from there. Now and again, I'm going to talk to you about this a little more in a bit when I talk about thesis statements. But when I say that it's okay to use a question at this point, I want to be very clear right off the top about the fact that I allow students to write questions in the introduction because that's where you're kind of framing your argument and your whole paper, what you're going to be writing about. But once you get past that introduction threshold, whether you're talking about just the thesis statement or the body paragraphs, I really, especially if students do it to an overbearing degree, I really don't want to see you directly stating questions um, later on in the paper for a couple reasons. One, I think what often comes out of that is a very sort of generic question and answer style of writing, which, while okay under certain circumstances, is kind of beneath the level of writing that I expect from all of you here. The other reason why I don't really approve of, people stating questions directly in a thesis or a body paragraph is simply the mindset, right? That as an academic writer, a college level writer, however you want to take ownership of that term, your focus should always be on answering questions and not and should be on answering questions and not asking them. So try to stay in that assertive, moving forward kind of mindset. Whereas when we simply ask a bunch of questions, yeah, it'll indicate your topic, but it comes off as very passive and non-effectual, if you will. Anyway, you can also begin by acknowledging an opinion or idea that opposes your argument. Now, the term that I'm going to use throughout this course for that opposing opinion that goes against your thesis is a counter argument. Now, I'm going to talk to you later on in the course about how to structure counter arguments within the body of a slightly more complex essay. But just be aware that if you want to describe a counter argument or counter arguments in the introduction, that's fine. But, keep that part brief with the understanding that you're going to go into more details on that information in the body of the paper. So you can certainly do that, but don't overdo that part of it, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And then finally, at least in this slide, you can always begin your introduction with a short story or anecdote that applies to your topic. Now notice that I highlight it both in a bold and underlined font, that the story or anecdote should clearly apply to your topic. So again, I've used this sort of broad topic heading a couple times already, but let's say that you're writing a paper about race relations in America. Unless you can really quickly after that tie it into a legitimate, straightforward thesis statement, you probably would not want to start that kind of paper with a racially oriented joke, regardless of what subgroup was a target of that joke. It would probably come off as somewhat crass and unprofessional, really. So, you know, that technique can work, but be careful. Because, sometimes even though your mind might be in the right place when you use that kind of joke, and you might think, boy, this will really, um, grab my audience's attention, even if you do intend to show them why, jokes like that can be harmful to people, can be hurtful. Just the presence of that joke being there will sometimes, turn the reader off, if you will, and make them not want to take your paper and your ideas seriously. So be aware that you can do that, but it should be appropriate and clearly apply to your topic, okay? So, thesis statements. Again, trying to keep it short. I think understanding a good thesis statement boils down to three concepts: focus, purpose, and being positive. First, the idea of focusing your thesis statement. You don't want to be too vague or too detailed. Usually, let me just back up by saying that usually a good thesis statement is going to, indicate on some level what your topic is, and then what you're trying to argue or prove in relation to that topic. So those are the two basic components. Thesis statements that are usually on the vague side of that equation are usually those that indicate a topic but don't really make it clear to the reader what you're going to argue about that topic. That's what I mean by being too vague. Sometimes, though, when students write their thesis statements, they go all the way to the other side of that equation. They become too detailed, and they say, I'm going to prove that this, whatever this may be, because of reasons X, Y, and Z. Now, the idea of making it clear, I'm going to argue, or I'm going to prove, or, reword that in the third person as you will, that's fine, but where you can go overboard is by adding too many because sort of statements into your thesis. Those because sort of proving details are important, but that kind of information generally works best if, you wait until the body of the essay to deal with that information rather than the introduction and thesis statement. So, you should also have a good sense in mind of what kind of paper you're writing. Generally speaking, in this course, you're going to be writing two different kind of papers. Informative papers, where you're just laying out, a combination of your thoughts on a topic combined with other sources on that topic, just sort of laying out the main points, main ideas in a non-judgmental, judgmental manner. There it is, non-judgmental manner. That's the informative style of an essay, where you're just kind of summarizing different viewpoints on that topic. The other kind of essay that we'll be dealing with more toward the end of the course is what you could call an argumentative essay. And an argumentative essay is where you're trying to take information from other sources and then not only show people what these people are saying about your topic, whether it's global warming, racism, or what about income inequality. There's another worthy topic. Um, it's where you're taking information from other sources and using that to build an argument that you want people to believe or to buy into. So, an assertive paper, again, is where you're trying to get people to accept an argument that you're going to make with your sources, where you're not just sort of passively summarizing them. Now, to go back to the idea of a thesis statement, if you're writing a summary paper, for a summary style paper, more along the lines of your first and third essays for this course, for summary style papers, you really just want to make sure that your thesis statement clearly summarizes the issue, the topic, whatever it may be that you're going to write about in that paper. So, for a summary or informative essay, you're just going to create a thesis statement that sort of displays your understanding of that content. Whereas, on the other end of that, when you're writing an assertive or persuasive or argumentative essay, whatever label you want to apply to it, which, by the way, will be more like your second and fourth essays in this course. You want to, for those style papers, you want to go a step further and assert what your perspective, your beliefs are on that particular topic, whatever it might be. So the purpose, the situation of what kind of paper you're trying to write will often dictate to you what kind of thesis you're going to then, employ in that paper. And then finally, on this point, you wanna be positive, and what I mean by that is, again, when you're creating a thesis statement, you want to assert your idea, even if your idea is just simply stating what you think is a good summary of what has been said on that topic. You're still making known what your summary of that topic is. But again, the other part of that, assert rather than ask. What I don't want to see you doing in a thesis statement, and it'll drive me nuts and it'll lower your grade, is to have you stating a question as your thesis statement. The questions have their place in the introduction, but again, by the time you get to the thesis and beyond, I want you to be, assertively stating your ideas. Okay? And then, oops, sorry about that, folks. Darn you, Windows 8, why do you hate me? It doesn't hate you, it's just an innocuous computer program. Anyway, moving on. Final recommendations. Broadly speaking, my final recommendation on this topic is don't feel too tied to your introduction and thesis statements. There are a couple different ways that this feeling of being tied to your introduction and thesis crops up. A lot of students, and I used to be one of them, would think that they had to write the introduction and thesis first before you could write the remainder of your essay. Now, don't get me wrong, if you want to write the paper that way, and if you're good at writing your papers that way, that's fine. But it is on the other side of that, if you're struggling with that introduction and thesis, it's fine to move on to your body paragraphs, work on them, and then come back and then develop the introduction and thesis later. I don't want you to get into that mindset of falsely believing that you absolutely have to write the introduction and thesis first when those components most definitely can come later in the writing process. So don't think that it always has to be a step one, step two, step three sort of mentality, right? When that's just not the case. Also, be aware, kind of same concept, that it's okay to change, even if you started the paper with your introduction thesis before you wrote anything else. Be aware that it is okay to change and revise the introduction and thesis statements after the rest of it is done. Sometimes students will get into the mindset of treating the introduction thesis like it's this great sort of epic part of an essay that's etched in stone once it's done and can never be changed. And if it were changed, the sky would fall and all sorts of terrible things would happen. But no, trust me, it's always a good idea when you're done with the draft of an essay to go back and as you read through it, ask yourself, do my body paragraphs match up with what I had outlined in, your introduction and thesis? And if the answer to the that question is no, then you're gonna have to do one of two things. You're gonna have to alter one or more of the body paragraphs in some way, or you're gonna have to change the introduction and thesis. And if you find that the introduction and thesis is spot on, is correct, and in the body paragraphs are the part that's the problem, then you had to be honest with the situation and be willing to, change those body paragraphs. Or, on the other side of that, if you evaluate and find that the problem, that imbalance between the introduction and thesis and the body paragraphs in your essay, if the root of that problem is in fact the introduction and thesis, then you know what? Revise the introduction and thesis. Why try to artificially change the body paragraphs when there's really nothing wrong with them? Okay, and that's well. Actually, I want to say one more thing before I forget, because I know if I don't say this, it's gonna drive me nuts. So I know it's not bulleted on the screen there, but I also want to mention this part about introductions and thesis statements. Generally, for the type of papers that you're gonna write in this course, and for that matter, many of the papers that you would go on to write in English 1060, the next course after this. For many of those papers, it is, quite alright to stick with the traditional idea that the introduction and thesis is all going to be wrapped up in the first paragraph. But be aware that as you move through your college careers, eventually you're probably going to have to write a longer paper, more of a full-blown research paper, kind of thing. And for those longer, more involved papers, it's quite alright to have, an introduction that's 2 or 3 paragraphs, sometimes more, and then have the introduction wherever the introduction have the thesis, wherever the introduction ends, whether it's the end of paragraph 1, the end of paragraph 2, or the end of page 2 for that matter. Just as an example, if any of you are crazy enough like I was to be an English major and then go on to English graduate school to become a teacher, when you get to that level, whether you like it or not, your whole grade is pretty much going to be determined on a 25 to 30 page research paper. And for a paper that long and that complex, it's quite appropriate and quite accepted to have an introduction that is maybe 3 pages long. And then again, add the thesis at the end of that 3 page introduction. So I want you to, rather than thinking, oh, my thesis has to be at the end of that first paragraph, and I absolutely have to have everything wrapped up by then, I rather want, as you go forward, not only in this course, but all the others that'll come later, I want you to have the clearer idea, I think, that the introduction and thesis length should be somewhat proportionate to the overall length of a paper. So if you're writing a fairly short essay like what we do in this course, stick with that, that idea that we're going to have it all wrapped up by the end of the first paragraph. But as you move along and have to write longer papers, be aware that it's okay to, end the introduction later, and by an extension of that, to put the thesis statement later in the overall flow of the paper. Okay? And that's it for now, but as always, if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to contact me, folks. Always here to help. That's what I'm here for. And try to ignore this part. And until next time, have a great day. Bye.